January 12th, 1888. The temperature hit minus 30 degrees across Dakota Territory, and the children's blizzard was killing cattle in barns that cost $300 to build. Samuel McPherson descended into Friedrich Adler's dugout expecting to find frozen corpses. Instead, warm air rushed out when the door opened. Inside, 68 cattle stood calm in 42-degree warmth. McPherson's own barn had dropped to minus 15 overnight. 87 of his animals were dead. Here, in a hole dug into a hillside for $41, every single animal was alive. The German immigrant had trusted earth instead of wood, thermal mass instead of conventional wisdom. And when the worst blizzard in territorial history tested every structure, the dirt walls held what expensive lumber couldn't. January 13th, 1888. The temperature held at 18 degrees below zero, and the snow drifts stood 12 feet high where the wind had piled them against anything that broke the prairie's flat expanse. Eric Jorgensen and Samuel McPherson trudged through the white silence, heading toward Friedrich Adler's homestead. Neither man spoke. Jorgensen had buried his daughter 2 hours earlier, 10 years old, found frozen 400 yards from their door. McPherson had spent the dawn counting cattle corpses in his barn. 87 dead, $1,218 gone. They expected to find Adler's family in the same condition. The German had no barn. Everyone knew that. He'd spent 5 months digging a hole in the ground while sensible men built proper shelter. Now the worst blizzard in Dakota Territory history had passed, and they were coming to see what was left. The sound reached them first, muffled lowing coming from beneath the snow. Both men stopped. McPherson pulled his thermometer from his coat, 18 below, confirmed. The lowing continued. Alive. Cattle. Somewhere underground. Steam rose from a snow-covered mound they'd thought was just another drift. Friedrich Adler emerged from an entrance they hadn't seen, his face gaunt and red-eyed, but breathing. McPherson descended the steps Adler had cut through 6 feet of accumulated snow. The door opened. Warm air rushed out, visible as fog in the brutal cold. Inside, 68 cattle stood calm in the lamplight, chewing hay as if winter were a distant rumor. McPherson's thermometer read 42 degrees. His barn, the one that cost him $350 and 6 weeks of hired labor, had dropped to 15 below during the storm. Here, in a dirt hole that cost $40, the temperature had never fallen below 40. Every single animal was alive. But 7 months earlier, when Friedrich Adler stepped off the train in Eureka with $85 and a pregnant wife, every rancher in the county told him the same thing. Without a proper barn, his cattle would die. May 15th, 1887. The wind hit Friedrich Adler's face the moment he stepped from the railroad car, carrying dust and the smell of grass baking under a sun that owned the sky. His wife Maria held their youngest daughter Greta's hand. His son Johann, 9 years old, carried the single trunk that contained everything they owned. Behind them, 400 miles of empty prairie stretched toward a horizon that looked like the edge of the world. Adler had $85 in cash, a deed to 160 acres he'd never seen, and a family that spoke no English. Maria was 5 months pregnant. The baby was due in September, the same month winter could arrive without warning this far north. The homestead site offered a single cottonwood grove near a creek, rolling prairie hills, and nothing else. No structure, no shelter, not even a fence. They slept in the wagon that first night. Johann asked the question Adler had been avoiding. "Papa, where will the cows sleep?" The cows. 68 head of cattle, purchased on credit from a broker in Eureka. $14 each, $952 total, due April 1st of the following year. Adler had leveraged himself 11 to 1, $952 of debt against $85 of capital. If even 10 animals died over the winter, he couldn't cover the payment. The bank would seize the homestead. The family would lose everything. He'd bought the cattle because Dakota Territory required it. You couldn't prove a homestead claim on farming alone, not in rangeland country. You needed livestock. You needed to ranch. And ranching meant keeping animals alive through a winter that could drop to 30 below zero and stay there for weeks. May 19th. Adler walked to Samuel McPherson's ranch, 8 miles south. McPherson had been in Dakota Territory 6 years. He ran 240 head of cattle. His barn was a proper 2-story structure, 40 feet by 60, with hay storage above and animal shelter below. It had cost $350 to build. McPherson showed Adler around, explaining the requirements. "Winter here kills anything that isn't proper sheltered," he said. His barn had 8-foot walls and a 12-foot roof peak. The height was essential. You needed 4 cords of hay stored above the cattle, which meant you needed vertical space. The walls were double-planked with tar paper between for insulation. The roof was shingled. There were ventilation gaps at the eaves. Adler asked about cost. McPherson listed it out. Lumber, $220 plus $60 freight from the railroad yard. Nails and hardware, $35. The labor took 6 weeks with help. Alone, it would take 3 to 4 months. Total, $315 minimum. Adler had 85. McPherson studied the German immigrant standing in his barn. "You can't ranch without proper shelter," he said, "and you can't build shelter without money. My advice? Go back to farming. Stick to what you know." Adler tried to explain that he understood earth, that he'd worked vineyards in Baden-Württemberg where they used hillside cellars to store wine. McPherson cut him off. "I've been through 6 winters here, son. Lost 20 head my first year in a cold snap, and that was with a wood barn. Anything less than 8-foot walls and a 12-foot roof, you're asking for dead animals." He shook his head. "You're German. You know vines. This isn't wine country. You'd best head back east before you get those children killed trying to prove something that can't be done." The math was impossible. Adler needed $315. He had 85. The bank in Eureka refused him a loan, immigrant, no English, no local reputation. William Carver, who ran the general store, would extend credit for supplies but not for lumber. Building a barn would take 3 to 4 months of solo work, and the cattle were arriving in 3 weeks. First frost typically came in late October, 5 months away, but it could arrive earlier. If he spent all summer building and winter came early, he'd lose everything anyway. The constraints felt like walls closing in. $85. No help. A pregnant wife. 2 children. 68 cattle arriving June 15th, winter coming, $952 due in April. If he failed, Maria would bear their 3rd child in a charity home while he worked as hired labor on someone else's ranch. Johann and Greta would be pulled from school. The family would spend years paying off a debt incurred from a single brutal winter. McPherson's words followed him on the 8-mile walk home. "Without a proper barn, your cattle will die." May 20th. Adler walked the creek-cut ravine that ran through his property, studying the exposed earth wall where erosion had carved into the hillside. 8 feet of stable clay stood vertical, dry, and solid. He pressed his hand against it. The air temperature was 85 degrees, but the earth felt cool, maybe 55, 60 degrees at most. He thought of the wine cellars in Germany. Dug into hillsides, earth-walled, they stayed cool all summer and warm all winter. Not warm like a fire. Warm like the earth itself, steady, unchanging, maybe 50 degrees year-round. The principle was thermal mass. Earth resisted temperature change. At 6 feet depth, the ground stayed near the annual average temperature, regardless of what the air above did. Adler did the calculation in his head. 68 cattle, each producing about 1,500 BTUs of heat per hour. That was 102,000 BTUs trapped in an enclosed space. In a wooden barn, that heat escaped through gaps in the planking, through the roof, carried away by wind that found every crack and seam. But Earth didn't have cracks. Earth absorbed heat and held it. If he dug into the hillside, 3 walls of earth, 1 wall of wood for access, and covered it with a sod roof, the cattle's own body heat would raise the interior temperature. The earth would store that warmth and release it slowly. The temperature inside wouldn't match the cattle's body heat of 101 degrees, but it wouldn't match the outside air either. It would equalize somewhere between the Earth's baseline of 45 degrees and the heat the animals produced. Maybe 42 degrees, maybe 45. Cold enough that cattle could survive it. warm enough that they wouldn't freeze. He sketched dimensions in the dirt. 60 feet long by 24 feet wide would give him 1,440 square feet. At 9 feet high in the center, that was roughly 11,000 cubic feet of volume. 68 cattle meant about 160 cubic feet per animal, adequate space. The excavation would take months, but he didn't need lumber except for the door frame, roof supports, and a ventilation shaft. The walls were free, they were earth. The roof would be cottonwood poles from the creek bottom covered with prairie sod cut in blocks. Sod was free. Poles were free, but labor-intensive to harvest. Total material cost, maybe $15 for minimal lumber, versus $315 for a conventional barn. The gamble was time. 4 to 5 months of digging versus 6 to 8 weeks of barn building with help. If winter arrived early, an unfinished dugout meant total loss. And if the design failed, if the ventilation was inadequate and the cattle suffocated, or if the roof collapsed under snow load, there would be no second chance. May 23rd. Eric Jorgensen rode up to Adler's property, dismounting near the creek where Adler had begun marking the dugout's outline with stakes. Jorgensen was Norwegian, 38 years old, with a small operation of 22 cattle. He'd built a lean-to barn the previous year, 3 walls and a roof, open on one side. It had cost him $85 and taken 3 weeks. "Heard you're planning to dig instead of build," Jorgensen said. Adler explained the concept in his broken English, gesturing at the hillside. "Earth holds warm, like wine cellar in Germany, stays same temperature always." Jorgensen studied the stakes, marking a 60-foot line. "Fritz, that's going to take you all summer. 4 months, maybe 5, digging by yourself. I built my barn in 3 weeks." "Barn costs $300, Adler said. "I have 85. "You'll still need lumber for the roof," Jorgensen said. "And what happens when snow drifts block your entrance? You won't be able to get in to feed them. They'll starve while you dig through 10 feet of snow." He shook his head. "And come spring thaw, that dirt's going to turn to mud. The whole thing will collapse. And then what?" Adler acknowledged the risks. "If I am wrong, I lose everything. If I am right—" He didn't finish the sentence. The uncertainty was visible on his face. Jorgensen's concern was genuine, not hostile. He'd lost 6 of 22 cattle his first winter in the lean-to. "Fritz, I got 22 head. You got 68 and no barn at all. You need to build proper, even if it takes longer." Maria appeared from the wagon, carrying baby Klaus, who'd been born 2 weeks earlier. She spoke in German, and Adler translated. "She says in Germany, root cellars keep potatoes through winter. Maybe they keep cows, too." Jorgensen mounted his horse. "I hope you're right," he said. "But I think you're betting your family's life on a hole in the ground." After he left, Adler stood at the edge of the excavation site, calculating what he was giving up. Every day spent digging was a day he couldn't spend on conventional preparation. If the dugout failed at month 3, it would be too late to build a barn. There was no backup plan. The choice was total commitment to an untested idea or admission that McPherson was right, that a German vineyard worker had no business ranching cattle in Dakota Territory. Johann found his father standing there at dusk. "Papa, are we digging tomorrow?" Adler looked at his son, 9 years old, barely strong enough to lift a spade, already carrying water buckets and moving stones to help. "Yes," he said, "we dig." Late May. Adler went to William Carver's general store in Eureka to buy tools. He needed a spade, a pickaxe, a saw, an auger for drilling the ventilation shaft, and nails. The total came to $14. Carver noticed what Adler wasn't buying. "That's all? Most ranchers spend $50–60 just on barn hardware." "I dig shelter in earth," Adler said. Carver's voice rose, loud enough for other customers to hear. "You're digging a hole for cattle?" 2 ranchers and a homesteader's wife turned to look. One of the ranchers laughed. "German doesn't know cattle from gophers." "Going to bury them alive," the other said. Carver leaned on the counter. "I'll give it till spring, Fritz, then I'll buy that homestead for the back debt." He said it casually, as if discussing weather, But the calculation was clear. Carver had financial interest in Adler's failure. The store had already extended $23 in credit for supplies. If Adler went under, Carver could acquire the homestead at auction, prime creek bottom land for cents on the dollar, and Carver profited from selling lumber for conventional barns. Every dugout meant lost revenue. The woman spoke up. Pregnant wife, and he's wasting time digging. At church the following Sunday, June 6th, the Adler family sat in the back row. Women whispered about Maria. Men discussed the foolishness of trying to outsmart the prairie with German ideas. The pastor's sermon that day was about prudence and wisdom over stubbornness and pride. Whether he meant it for Adler or not, the message landed like an accusation. By early July, Adler was 2 months into excavation. The hole measured 35 feet long, 20 feet wide, 7 feet deep, 60% complete. He'd been digging 14 hours a day in 90-degree heat, and the work showed on his body. He'd lost 12 pounds. His hands had blistered, calloused, then cracked and bled. He fell asleep at the supper table. McPherson and Carver arrived on horseback that afternoon, a coordinated visit. They stood at the edge of the dugout, looking down at Adler working below. "Fritz, I've been ranching here 6 years," McPherson said. "Every man who tried to shortcut on shelter lost animals. You need to stop this and build proper." Carver added his piece. "Your cattle arrive in 3 weeks. You're not even half done. There's still time to buy lumber. I'll extend your credit." It was a trap. More debt meant more control. If Adler accepted Carver's lumber on credit and then failed anyway, he'd owe even more. The homestead would be worth less than the debt. Carver would acquire it for nothing. Adler climbed out of the excavation, facing both men. His English faltered under pressure, but he tried. "Earth holds warm. I know this from Germany." "You know wine cellars, not cattle barns," McPherson said. "Different thing entirely." "I finish in 3 months," Adler said. "You will see." Carver smiled. "See you in spring, Fritz, when we're dividing your land." They rode away, leaving Adler standing beside a hole that still needed another 25 feet of length, 2 feet of depth, and a roof that didn't exist yet. The cattle were arriving in 3 weeks. He had $68 left. Maria was 7 months pregnant. And the first frost could come as early as mid-September. That night, Johann asked his father the question that had been building. "Papa, what if Mr. McPherson is right?" Adler sat in the dugout after dark, pressing his hand against the earth wall. It still felt cool despite the summer heat above. "I think the earth will hold warm," he told his son. "I think." The uncertainty in his voice was the truth neither of them wanted to hear. June 1st. Adler began the work that would define the next 4 months. Dawn to dusk, 14 to 16 hours a day, he broke hardpan clay with the pickaxe and removed loosened earth with the spade. The wheelbarrow carried loads up the entrance ramp he was building from excavated dirt. 8 to 10 cubic feet per day, brutal labor in heat that climbed past 90 degrees most afternoons. The math didn't work. 11,000 cubic feet to remove, divided by 10 cubic feet per day, meant 1,100 days of work compressed into 120 days. He needed to average 90 cubic feet per day, 9 times his current pace. The realization hit him the first week. He was too slow. He would fail unless he found a way to work harder, faster, longer than seemed physically possible. By early July, his body was changing in ways Maria noticed. Weight dropping, about a pound per week. The blisters on his hands had become calluses. Then the calluses cracked and bled. He fell asleep at supper multiple times, too exhausted to stay upright. Johann, 9 years old, began helping. He couldn't lift a pickaxe, but he could carry smaller loads of dirt, hand water down into the excavation, bring meals so his father didn't have to walk back to the wagon. July 20th. The cattle arrived. 68 head, delivered by the broker from Eureka. They had no shelter, so Adler spent 3 days building a temporary rope and post corral. 3 days not digging, 270 cubic feet of progress lost. But the cattle were now present, grazing the open range, a visible daily reminder of what was at stake. Every morning and evening, Adler looked at them and did the survival math. 68 head. If 10 died, he couldn't cover the debt. By the end of August, he'd reached 50 feet long, 22 feet wide, 8 feet deep, 82% complete by volume. But a new problem emerged. The earth walls were beginning to crack under pressure at the rear of the excavation. He needed temporary supports, cottonwood poles from the creek, which meant 5 days harvesting timber instead of digging. Another setback, another week lost. August 28th, 7 weeks until typical first frost. The entrance to the dugout now descended into darkness that smelled of fresh earth and stone. Adler worked by lantern light at the back of the excavation, extending the final 10 feet. His shirt stuck to his back with sweat despite being 40 feet underground where the temperature stayed cool. September 2nd. He went to Carver's store to buy the minimal lumber needed for roof supports and the door. 12 12-foot 2x6 boards cost $12. Door planks cost $8. Hardware cost $3. Total, $23, exactly equal to the store credit he'd accumulated. He was buying on debt he'd have to repay. Carver watched him load the lumber. So you are buying wood after all. Should have done this months ago instead of digging. Only for roof, Adler said. Earth is walls. Earth walls, wood roof, Carver said. It'll collapse by January. You'll see. September 3rd through 8th. Adler walked to the cottonwood grove by the creek and began felling trees for roof poles. He needed 40 poles, 8 to 10 inches diameter, 12 feet long. Each one weighed between 150 and 200 pounds. Jorgensen showed up the second day and helped without being asked. They worked together for 2 days, cutting and trimming and dragging poles uphill to the dugout site. I still think you're crazy, Jorgensen said, but I'll help you be crazy. It was the first kindness anyone had shown since construction began. September 9th through 20th. The roof went up in sections. Poles laid across the 24-foot width, spaced every 18 inches. The 2x6 boards at entrance and rear provided structural support. Then came the sod. Prairie grass cut in 3-inch thick blocks, layered 18 to 24 inches deep. The total weight was approximately 45 tons. It had to support that plus snowdrifts that could reach 10 or 15 feet. September 18th. Adler woke to frost on the ground. 28 degrees. First frost 2 to 3 weeks earlier than average. The realization hit like a fist to the chest. Winter was arriving ahead of schedule. If the pattern held, he had maybe 4 weeks of mild weather left instead of 6. The panic drove him harder. He worked through meals, through exhaustion, through the warning signs his body was sending. September 21st, he walked on the completed roof to test its integrity. It held without cracking, the cottonwood poles and sod were supporting his weight, plus the structural load. But the door wasn't finished, the ventilation shaft wasn't installed, and the interior still needed drainage channels. September 22nd and 23rd. The ventilation shaft went in, an 8-inch diameter pipe made from scavenged stove sections, running from the roof peak 12 feet down to the interior. Too small, and the cattle would suffocate from carbon dioxide buildup. Too large in heat would escape faster than the animals could generate it. 8 inches was the calculated balance. He covered the top with wire mesh to prevent snow infiltration while allowing airflow. September 24th through 28th. The door took 4 days to build and hang. Heavy planks 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall, mounted on iron hinges that cost another $1.50 added to his store credit. It had to seal against wind but allow daily access for feeding. He caulked the frame with rope to create weatherproofing. September 25th, mid-afternoon. Adler was hauling sod blocks to finish the roof's final section when his vision tunneled and his legs stopped working. He fell forward into the grass. Maria found him unconscious 20 minutes later. The cause was exhaustion, dehydration, and inadequate food. He'd been skipping meals to save time. Maria made him stay in bed September 26th and 27th, 2 full days of lost work when the deadline was screaming toward him. Johann and Greta finished placing the final sod blocks alone, children doing work meant for adults. When Adler tried to get up the second day, Maria blocked the wagon entrance. "If you die digging," she said in German, "the children lose everything anyway." September 28th. Jorgensen returned with bread, butter, and preserved meat from his wife, worth $3 or $4, disguised as a gift to Maria rather than charity to Adler. My wife says Maria needs help with that baby coming. The subtext was clear. They were broke, and everyone knew it. The choice was between pride and survival. Jorgensen stayed and helped install the door, saving Adler a full day of work. Before leaving, he said what they'd both been avoiding. Still think you're crazy, Fritz, but you're a tough kind of crazy. September 29th. Evening. Maria's labor began. Adler had to choose between finishing the door latch and attending the birth. Johann helped complete the latch while Adler assisted Maria in the wagon. Klaus was born healthy just before midnight. A third child. A new vulnerability. An infant who would face winter in a dugout homestead with parents who had $43 remaining and a hole in the ground that might or might not keep cattle alive. October the 15th. The dugout was complete. Adler moved all 68 cattle inside. They walked down the entrance ramp into darkness, into earth-walled space that smelled of fresh dirt and hay. The dimensions were exactly as calculated. 60 feet long, 24 feet wide, 9 feet high at center, 1,440 square feet. The cottonwood poles overhead supported 2 feet of prairie sod. The ventilation shaft protruded from the roof like a chimney, its wire mesh cap visible against the sky. Final cost: tools $14, lumber $23, hardware $4.50, total $41.50, versus $315 for a conventional barn. Adler had $43.50 remaining from his original $85. Everything else had gone into tools, materials, and the supplies needed to keep his family barely alive through 4 months of labor that had reduced his body to sinew and exhaustion. He stood inside the dugout that first evening, holding a lantern, watching the cattle settle into their new shelter. The earth walls felt solid under his hand. The temperature inside was already noticeably warmer than the October air outside, maybe 6 or 8 degrees differential. The cattle weren't bunched for warmth. They were calm, chewing hay, behaving as if this underground barn were no different from any conventional structure. The design would work or it wouldn't. The calculations were either correct or they weren't. Winter was coming, and there was no backup plan, no second chance, no way to undo the choice he'd made 7 months earlier when he pressed his hand against the creek-cut earth wall and decided to trust what the ground had been telling him. October 20th. The first real cold arrived. The temperature outside dropped to 24 degrees overnight. Adler checked the thermometer inside the dugout at dawn. 41 degrees, a 17-degree differential. All 68 cattle alive, calm, showing no signs of stress. But McPherson's warning echoed in Adler's memory from that visit back in July. You haven't seen real cold yet. Wait until January. 20 below, 30 below. That's when barns are tested. The dugout was working, but winter hadn't truly arrived yet. October 16th, morning temperature outside, 32 degrees. Inside the dugout, 43 degrees. Adler checked each animal individually, looking for signs of stress, bunching for warmth, labored breathing, reluctance to eat. Nothing. They behaved as if the temperature were mild. October 20th, outside 28 degrees, inside 42 degrees. October 25th, outside 24 degrees, inside 41 degrees. A pattern was emerging. The interior temperature held 15 to 18 degrees warmer than outside air, regardless of what the thermometer above ground showed. The ventilation shaft was working, no suffocation, adequate air circulation. The cattle's body heat was raising the temperature above the Earth's baseline of 45 degrees, and the Earth mass was storing that warmth. Early November brought the first significant test. November 3rd, the temperature dropped to 8 degrees overnight. Adler stayed awake, checking the thermometer every hour, walking down into the dugout with a lantern to watch the cattle. The interior held at 38 degrees, a 30-degree differential. By morning, all 68 animals were alive, calm, chewing hay as if nothing had happened. Johann noticed it first. "Papa, they don't look cold at all." They didn't. No bunching, no visible stress, no frost forming on their hides. The dugout was working exactly as Adler had calculated. November 7th, McPherson arrived unannounced, riding up to the homestead with a thermometer in his coat pocket. He'd heard reports from other ranchers who'd passed by and seen steam rising from Adler's ventilation shaft. He wanted to verify the numbers himself. Adler led him into the dugout. Outside temperature, 15 degrees. McPherson's thermometer, he'd brought his own, not trusting Adler's readings, confirmed 40 degrees inside. A 25-degree differential. McPherson touched the earth wall. It felt warm to his hand, warmer than the air. The cattle stood calmly in the lantern light. No panic, no distress. He counted them twice. 68, all alive. "It's holding warm, I'll give you that," McPherson said. Then came the warning Adler had been dreading. "But you haven't seen real cold yet. Wait until January." McPherson's voice carried the weight of 6 winters' experience. 20 below, 30 below, that's when barns are tested. Earth will freeze through at those temperatures. Your shelter will be ice. He left without saying more, but the prediction hung in the air like smoke. January. Real cold. The test that would prove whether Adler's calculations were correct or whether McPherson's conventional wisdom would be vindicated in the worst possible way. November the 10th. Adler went to Carver's store for salt, oats, and kerosene. Carver was talking to other customers when Adler entered, and he didn't lower his voice. "Adler's hole is keeping cattle warm so far," he said, as if discussing an amusing curiosity. "Wait until the real cold hits. January, February, that's when cattle die." The other ranchers nodded. One of them said what they were all thinking. Wood barns get tested in the hard months. The expectation was clear. Everyone was waiting for failure. The early success meant nothing. Winter's true test was still coming. Through November, the performance held steady. Temperature differential, 18 to 25 degrees warmer inside than outside. 0 cattle mortality. Feed consumption normal, no stress eating. Adler weighed 12 head mid-November and found no significant weight loss. The manure buildup was manageable, cleaned weekly. Ammonia levels stayed acceptable because the ventilation was working, but the resource count was tightening. Hay stores, 8 tons, estimated 6 to 7 weeks remaining at current consumption. Coal for heating the house, 1/4 ton left. Food supplies adequate through January, tight after that. Cash remaining, $41, no emergency cushion. And the debt, $973 due April 1st, still loomed like a cliff edge approaching in the dark. December came mild. Temperatures ranged from 15 to 25 degrees most days, relatively warm for Dakota Territory winter. Inside the dugout, the temperature held steady at 38 to 42 degrees. The cattle remained calm. The community observed the easy winter and drew its own conclusions. "Let's see what January brings," they said. Old-timers pointed to signs they trusted more than thermometers. The woolly caterpillars had been thick that fall, meant hard winter coming. The almanac predicted severe cold for January and February. The cattle were growing thicker coats than usual, their bodies preparing for something their instincts sensed. High clouds meant cold air moving south from Canada. The worst was still ahead. Everyone felt it. January 1st through 10th, 1888. The mild pattern continued. 10 to 20 degrees outside, 40 to 43 degrees inside the dugout. Adler's confidence began to build. 5 months of work. The earth was holding warm exactly as he'd known it would. But Maria said the thing he'd been thinking and not voicing. "It feels too easy, Fritz." She was right. McPherson's warning had specified the test. 20 below, 30 below. Real cold. They hadn't faced it yet. January 10th, evening. The temperature began dropping rapidly. By dawn, it would be different. January 11th, 1888. Morning temperature, 15 degrees above zero. The sky was clear, the sun bright, no warning signs visible. School was in session. Johann and Greta walked the 2 miles to the schoolhouse, along with 14 other children from nearby homesteads. It felt like any other winter day. Adler's morning routine: check the cattle at 6 a.m. Inside the dugout, 42 degrees, all 68 animals calm. Hay stores down to 4.5 tons, 3 to 4 weeks remaining. Tight, but survivable if the cattle sale happened on schedule in April. He climbed out into the January sunshine and began his day's work: repair a damaged fence section, haul water from the creek where he'd cut an ice hole. McPherson rode past mid-morning. "Nice day, Fritz," he called out. "Enjoy it while it lasts." 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The temperature was still 15 above, but something felt wrong. Adler had spent enough months watching Dakota weather to sense the shift before it became visible. The air pressure was changing. High, thin clouds were appearing where the sky had been clear an hour earlier. The wind was beginning to rise from the northwest. 1:15. He made the decision: walk to the schoolhouse, bring Johann and Greta home early, 2 miles each way. He'd be back in an hour and a half. He left the homestead at 1:20, 2 o'clock. The temperature was dropping visibly now, falling degree by degree, as if someone were draining heat from the world. The wind hit 30 miles per hour. By 2:15, light snow began, flurries that became heavy within minutes. 2:30, wind 40 miles per hour, visibility dropping. Adler was halfway to the schoolhouse when the whiteout hit. He tried to follow fence lines, the standard frontier practice for staying oriented in blizzards. But the fence ended 3/4 of a mile from the school, and open prairie stretched between him and his children. 2:45. Full blizzard conditions, wind 50 miles per hour or higher, temperature minus 10 degrees and still falling. Visibility, 5 feet maximum, wind chill, minus 45 degrees, exposed skin freezing in minutes. Adler stood at the point where the fence ended, facing a choice that felt like choosing which child to save. Continue forward and risk getting lost. People died 50 feet from their own barns in whiteouts like this, disoriented, wandering in circles until hypothermia took them. Or turn back and leave Johann and Greta at the schoolhouse, trusting the teacher to keep them overnight. He thought it through. The children were in a building with a wood stove and other children. The teacher, Miss Cartwright, would keep them safe. It was standard practice in sudden blizzards. But if he continued and died in the prairie between here and there, Maria and baby Klaus would be alone with 68 cattle and no way to manage them. If he turned back, he'd be choosing to survive over retrieving his children, and that choice would never stop echoing. He turned back. The return journey took 45 minutes to cover 1 mile. He couldn't see the fence, only feel for it with his hands. The wind tore at his coat. His face went numb, then started burning, frostbite beginning. He reached the homestead at 3:20, barely able to feel his hands. 3:30. Inside the wagon where they still lived, Adler hadn't built a proper house yet. Maria was holding Klaus. The baby was fevering. High fever, labored breathing, lethargy. Likely influenza, common and deadly for 4-month-old infants. Maria was trying to cool him with compresses while keeping him warm enough, monitoring his breathing to make sure his lungs weren't filling with fluid. "I cannot leave him, Fritz," she said, which meant Adler was alone to manage the cattle check. 4:30. The temperature outside had dropped to minus 27 degrees. Wind gusts were hitting 55 miles per hour. The distance from the house to the dugout entrance, 75 yards. In clear weather, a 1-minute walk. In zero visibility with wind strong enough to knock a man down, it became a life-or-death navigation problem. Adler tied a rope around his waist and anchored it to the door handle. The rope was 50 feet long, not quite enough to reach the dugout. He'd have to navigate the final 25 yards by dead reckoning, by memory of where the entrance should be. If he got disoriented, if he walked past it in the whiteout, he'd wander into open prairie and die within minutes. He carried a lantern that blew out the moment he stepped outside. A shovel, in case snow was blocking the entrance. A hay fork for feeding. 4:30 departure. Minus 27 degrees. Wind gusting 55. The first 50 feet following the rope was manageable. His hands gripped the line, pulling himself forward against wind that felt like being shoved by an invisible hand. Snow hit his face like thrown sand. The rope ended. 25 yards to go. He continued in the direction he believed was correct. counting steps, trying to maintain a straight line when the wind was pushing him sideways. 10 steps. 15. 20. He should have reached the entrance. Nothing but snow and darkness. Panic hit like ice water. He'd walked past it. He turned in a circle, not sure anymore which way led back to the rope and which way led to the prairie and death. He dropped to his hands and knees and began crawling in expanding circles, feeling with his hands for anything: the entrance, the mound of earth above the dugout, the rope, anything solid. 5 minutes of searching. His hands were going numb. Then he felt it. The rope, invisible in the blowing snow. He followed it forward, recalculated, found the entrance 10 feet to the left of where he'd been searching. The entrance was partially blocked by a 3-foot snowdrift that had accumulated in the 30 minutes since the blizzard intensified. He dug through with the shovel, opened the door, and stumbled inside. The temperature inside the dugout, 41 degrees. 68-degree differential from the minus 27 outside. The cattle stood calm in the lamplight, not bunched together for warmth the way animals did when they were cold. They were chewing hay from the morning feeding, behaving as if winter were happening somewhere else. The ventilation shaft was working. Adler could feel air moving near the roof peak, fresh air flowing in while warm air vented out. No suffocation risk, no stress signs. He checked them individually, walking among them, looking for frozen limbs or labored breathing or any indication that the cold was penetrating their shelter. Nothing. They had adequate hay for morning. He could delay the evening feeding until morning if the blizzard continued. Time inside, 10 minutes. He verified what he needed to verify. The dugout was working perfectly. The return journey was worse. The snowdrift at the entrance had rebuilt itself, 12 inches accumulated in 10 minutes. He dug through it, emerged into minus 29 degrees and wind that felt strong enough to pick him up and throw him. He couldn't find the rope. He dropped to hands and knees again, crawling in circles, feeling for the line while his fingers stopped registering sensation. 5 minutes of searching before he found it. He followed the rope back to the house, hand over hand, barely able to grip. Arrival time, 5:15, nearly hypothermic. His face was severely frostbitten around the eyes where the scarf hadn't covered. Maria pulled him inside and put him near the stove. Klaus was still fevering. Maria couldn't leave him. Outside, the temperature continued dropping. By 7 o'clock, it hit minus 30 degrees. The wind sustained 50 miles per hour or higher all night. Snow accumulated 2 to 3 inches per hour. The sound was terrifying, wind shrieking around the wagon, shaking the frame, making sleep impossible. 10 o'clock. Adler said he should check the cattle again. Maria's response was immediate. "You almost died checking them once. The dugout is working or it isn't." She was right. The gamble was already made. Trust the earth insulation or don't. Going out again in minus 30 degrees wouldn't change anything except risk his life for information that didn't matter until morning. Klaus's fever stayed high through the night. Maria kept vigil. Adler sat by the window, staring into blackness, thinking about Johann and Greta at the schoolhouse. Were they warm? Were they frightened? Was the teacher keeping the stove burning? Had any children tried to walk home and gotten lost? He wouldn't know until morning. None of them would. Across the county, in wooden barns that cost $300 and $400 to build, cattle were dying. McPherson's barn, the one he'd showed Adler back in May with such confidence, was dropping below minus 15 degrees inside. The double-planked walls with tar paper insulation weren't enough. The gaps between planks had shrunk in the cold, creating drafts that no amount of caulking could seal. 240 cattle bunched together, trying to share warmth, but the youngest calves were succumbing. By 2 in the morning, McPherson was watching them die and couldn't do anything to stop it. He tried heating the barn with a coal stove, fire risk be damned, but he couldn't raise the interior temperature above minus 10. By dawn, 87 would be dead, $1,218 gone. Jorgensen's lean-to, the 3-walled structure that had cost him $85 and seemed adequate in normal winters, was offering almost no protection. The interior temperature matched the exterior, minus 22 degrees. His 22 cattle crowded against the back wall, trying to escape wind that found every opening. 8 would die before morning, and Jorgensen's daughter Ingrid, 10 years old, had been caught walking home from school when the blizzard hit. She'd made it 400 yards from their homestead before hypothermia took her. Her body wouldn't be found until January 13th, frozen in a snowdrift within sight of their door. William Carver's barn was better built than Jorgensen's, worse than McPherson's. Interior temperature, minus 18 degrees. 12 of 35 cattle would die. $168 in losses. Across Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Minnesota, the children's blizzard was killing people who'd been caught outdoors when it struck. 235 deaths in 16 hours. Most of them children walking home from school, disoriented in the whiteout, dying within yards of safety. The livestock mortality would reach 30 to 50% region-wide. $3 to $5 million in losses, equivalent to 90 to 150 million in future currency. But in a dirt hole that cost $41.50 to build, 68 cattle stood in 42-degree warmth, protected by thermal mass and calculations that a German vineyard worker had trusted over the certainty of men who'd ranched Dakota Territory for years. 5 o'clock in the morning, January 12th. Klaus's fever broke. His breathing eased. He fell asleep peacefully. Maria slumped in exhaustion, but the crisis had passed. Outside, the temperature had reached minus 30 degrees, the coldest point of the blizzard. The wind was calming to 20 or 30 miles per hour. Visibility was improving to 50 or 100 feet. The storm was passing, 6:30. Adler prepared for the morning check, same rope technique. The snow drifts had grown overnight. He had to dig a path with the shovel. 20 minutes of work just across 75 yards. The dugout entrance was buried under 6 feet of accumulated snow. He dug for 30 minutes to reach the door. The door opened. Warm air rushed out, visible as steam when it hit minus 30-degree air. Interior temperature, 42 degrees. 72-degree differential from outside. All 68 cattle alive, calm, chewing hay, no visible stress, no frozen limbs, no deaths. The ventilation shaft's height, 12 feet above the original ground level, had kept it above the snowdrifts. Air was still flowing. The earth walls had held the warmth exactly as Adler had calculated 7 months earlier when he'd pressed his hand against the creek-cut clay and decided to trust what the ground was telling him. He stood in the lamplight, watching the cattle, feeling nothing that resembled triumph. Only quiet relief mixed with the terror of not knowing if Johann and Greta were alive. 7 o'clock. The blizzard had calmed enough to attempt the walk to the schoolhouse. 2 miles through waist-deep snow and minus 18-degree cold. 90 minutes of brutal travel. The schoolhouse appeared through the snow, still standing, smoke rising from the chimney. Inside, 14 children had sheltered overnight. Miss Cartwright had kept the coal stove burning, rationing the fuel to make it last. Johann and Greta were alive, frightened, hungry, but unharmed. 3 children from other families had tried to walk home yesterday when the storm started. Their bodies were somewhere in the snowdrifts, not yet recovered. Jorgensen's daughter was among the dead. January 13th, 10 o'clock in the morning, temperature minus 18 degrees. Jorgensen and McPherson were trudging toward Adler's homestead, coming to see what was left. Jorgensen had buried Ingrid 2 hours earlier, 10 years old, found frozen 400 yards from home. McPherson had spent the dawn counting corpses in his barn, 87 cattle dead, more than a third of his herd. Both men expected to find Adler's family in similar condition. The German had no barn. He dug a hole in the ground while sensible men built proper shelter. The worst blizzard in Dakota Territory history had just passed. Surely everything was gone. The sound reached them first, muffled lowing coming from underground. Both men stopped walking. The sound was impossible. Cattle. Alive. Somewhere beneath the snow-covered prairie. Steam rose from what they'd thought was just a drift. Adler emerged from an entrance they hadn't seen, his face exhausted, but alive. McPherson descended the steps Adler had cut through the snow. The door opened. Warm air rushed out like breath. Inside, 68 cattle stood calm in lamplight. They were chewing hay, not bunched in panic, showing no signs of cold stress. McPherson pulled his thermometer from his coat, the one he'd brought on his November visit, the one he trusted more than other men's readings. 42 degrees inside, minus 18 outside. 60-degree differential. His barn had dropped to minus 15 during the storm. 87 of his 240 cattle had died. Here, in a dugout that cost $41, every animal was alive. Jorgensen touched the earth wall. "It's warm," he said, his voice breaking. "The dirt is actually warm." The realization was spreading across his face, grief over his daughter, guilt over doubting, the terrible understanding that he could have built differently. "I should have listened," he said. "Should have built like you did." Adler's response was quiet. "Your barn kept most alive. You could not know the storm would be this bad." But they both knew that wasn't true. The storm had been survivable with the right shelter. Adler's shelter had worked. Jorgensen's hadn't, and the difference was a daughter's life. McPherson stood silent, running calculations in his head. 6 winters of experience. A $350 barn built to American standards. 87 head lost at $14 each. $1,218 gone in 16 hours, while a German immigrant who'd spent $41 on lumber and sod had lost nothing. "I was wrong, Fritz," McPherson said finally. "Dead wrong." The words came hard. Authority figures didn't admit error easily, but the evidence was surrounding him. 68 living cattle in earth-warmed space while his own barn had become a tomb. 6 winters I've ranched here. Built my barn American style. Cost me $350. Tonight it failed. He touched the earth wall the way Jorgensen had, feeling warmth that shouldn't exist in minus 18-degree weather. "Lost 87 head. $1,218 gone. You spent $40 and lost nothing." Adler didn't respond. There was nothing to say that the temperature differential hadn't already said. McPherson pulled out a notebook. "I need to know how you designed this. Every measurement, every calculation, where you put the ventilation, how deep you dug, how thick the roof is." His voice carried urgency now, the desperation of a man who just lost a year's profit and was trying to prevent it happening again. Adler explained the thermal mass principle, speaking slowly through his limited English. "Earth at 6 feet depth stays 45 to 50 degrees always. In summer, in winter, always same." "Heat retention," McPherson said, understanding now what he'd dismissed 7 months earlier. "Cattle give heat, 1,500 BTUs per animal per hour. Wood barn loses it through cracks in the walls, gaps that open when the planks shrink in cold. But Earth holds it," Adler finished. "Absorbs heat, releases slowly. Temperature equalizes between Earth baseline and animal heat." McPherson was writing it down. 68 cattle times 1,500 BTUs equals 102,000 BTUs per hour, trapped by earth mass instead of escaping through wood gaps. The ventilation shaft, 8 inches at roof peak, had to be large enough for air circulation, but small enough to prevent excessive heat loss. "The balance," Adler said, gesturing at the shaft. "Enough air, not too much loss." By afternoon, word had spread through Eureka. Ranchers were comparing losses. The regional average was running 40 to 50% mortality. Most wooden barns had dropped to minus 15 or minus 20 inside during the storm. Cattle had frozen in structures that were supposed to protect them. Adler had lost 0. Temperature had held at 42 degrees. The comparison felt like an indictment. January 14th. The church service was the largest attendance in months. 11 children dead in the county, including 3 from the local school. Jorgensen sat with his family in the front row, his daughter's empty seat visible to everyone. The pastor spoke about loss, faith, resilience, words that felt inadequate against the arithmetic of frozen children and cattle corpses. After the service, ranchers approached Adler with questions. "How deep did you dig? What are the dimensions? Where did you put the ventilation? How thick is the sod roof?" The questions came rapid fire. Men who'd lost 30 or 40% of their herds trying to understand how a German immigrant with no ranching experience had outsurvived them. Adler answered each question patiently. 60 feet long, 24 wide, 9 high. Earth walls on 3 sides. Cottonwood pole roof with 18 to 24 inches of sod. 8-inch ventilation shaft at the peak. 6 feet minimum depth to reach stable earth temperature. He offered to help anyone who wanted to build. No secrecy, no proprietary method. I will help anyone, he said. We start in May when ground thaws. Jorgensen approached last. Can you help me build one for next winter? Yes, Adler said. I help you dig. I'll pay you for your time. No, you helped me harvest poles. I help you dig. It was frontier reciprocity, the mutual aid that kept people alive when commercial transactions couldn't. January 15th, William Carver heard the detailed reports in his general store, multiple ranchers describing Adler's 0 losses, the 42-degree interior temperature, the cattle standing calm while others' herds were dying. Carver had lost 12 of 35 animals himself, $168 in cattle value gone. His pride was wounded worse than his finances. He'd predicted Adler's failure publicly, had positioned himself to acquire the homestead at auction. Now Adler had succeeded. The homestead was secure, and Carver looked like a fool. When another customer asked about it, Carver's response was grudging. Adler got lucky with that hole. The customer pressed. Lucky? 42 degrees in -30 weather. Fine, Carver said. The earth shelter worked. Once. In one storm. He refused full conversion, unwilling to admit the depth of his error, but he made one concession. Adler's $23 store credit was marked paid. Consider it settled, he said when Adler came in for supplies. The subtext was clear. Carver didn't want to be in debt to the man he'd tried to undermine. To Adler directly, Carver managed only minimal acknowledgement. You proved something, Fritz. I'll give you that. The bitterness would never fully fade, but he stopped actively working against Adler, and in frontier communities, that was as close to conversion as hostile skeptics came. Spring 1888, April 1st. Adler sold his cattle at the Eureka Depot. 68 head, spring price averaging $15.62 per animal. Total revenue, $1,062. The debt, $952 for cattle, $21 in miscellaneous credit, came to $973 total. He paid it in full. Profit, $89. The first positive margin. Small, but enough to prove the concept worked not just thermally, but economically. By late spring, 4 other ranchers near Eureka had begun digging dugout barns. Adler consulted on each one, helping with design and excavation, accepting no payment. Jorgensen's dugout went up through the summer of 1888, with Adler providing the same labor Jorgensen had offered the previous year. The winter of 1888 to 1889 tested the new dugouts. Regional mortality averaged 20 to 25%. Bad, but not as catastrophic as the children's blizzard. The 4 new earth-sheltered barns reported 5 to 8% losses, mostly from causes unrelated to cold. The thermal principle held, earth mass stored warmth, ventilation prevented suffocation, cattle survived. By 1890, 11 earth-sheltered barns existed within 20 miles of Eureka. The method was spreading slowly through demonstration and shared knowledge rather than commercial promotion. But the spread was limited. American-born ranchers preferred conventional wooden structures. They signaled prosperity and permanence. Earth shelters carried stigma, seen as poverty solutions for immigrants who couldn't afford real barns. The labor intensity made them impractical for large operations, and geography limited them. You needed hillsides or stable soil, which wasn't available everywhere. The innovation worked, but it remained marginal. Cultural resistance proved stronger than thermal efficiency. Adler's later life followed the pattern of successful homesteaders. 1890. He expanded the herd to 120 cattle and built a second dugout barn. Through the 1890s, he consulted on 15 more earth-sheltered structures across central Dakota, becoming quietly known as the man who understood Earth. Johann learned ranching and took over the operation in 1900. Greta married a local farmer in 1898. Klaus grew healthy and strong, the infant who'd fevered during the children's blizzard surviving to adulthood. Adler died in 1910 at age 57 from pneumonia. His headstone in Eureka Cemetery notes, "He understood the earth." The original dugout, built in 1887, remained in use until approximately 1930, 48 years of service from cottonwood poles and prairie sod. The roof finally collapsed around 1935, the organic materials decaying past structural integrity. The site today is an indentation in a hillside, partially filled with soil, unmarked by any historical marker. Local history lost. The method itself evolved and then faded. Through 1920, ranchers developed improvements: multi-shaft ventilation systems, stronger engineered roof supports, sophisticated floor drainage using tile. Some built hybrid structures, conventional wooden barns with earth bermed against the walls, combining thermal mass with familiar construction methods. But by 1920, mechanization was changing everything. Tractors made conventional barn building easier. Railroad expansion reduced lumber freight costs. Modern insulation materials, fiberglass, foam, solved heat loss differently than earth mass had. Earth shelters became associated with the poverty and hardship of the Saudi era, something to escape rather than preserve. By 1960, most dugout barns had collapsed or been filled in. The innovation was forgotten, remembered only as a curiosity from the desperate early settlement years. Then the 1970s energy crisis renewed interest in passive heating and cooling. Architects rediscovered earth-sheltered design as valid thermal management. The same principles Adler had intuited from wine cellars appeared in modern construction. Earth-bermed homes using thermal mass, geothermal systems exploiting stable underground temperatures, root cellars returning to homesteads. Modern research validated what Adler had calculated by hand. Earth at 6 feet depth maintained stable temperature year-round, 45 to 52 degrees in Dakota Territory, matching his observations. Thermal mass studies confirmed that Earth absorbs and releases heat slowly, resisting rapid temperature change. Livestock comfort research showed that cattle tolerate temperatures as low as 40 degrees without stress, exactly the range Adler's dugout maintained. Energy efficiency data proved Earth-sheltered structures use 50 to 70% less heating and cooling energy than conventional buildings. The cost-benefit ratio still favored earth construction for those willing to do the excavation labor. The principle Adler had trusted, that the earth holds what we need, turned out to be scientifically accurate. He'd just been ahead of the research by 90 years. The dugout site is still visible if you know where to look. A subtle indentation in a hillside near Eureka, South Dakota, where a creek cuts through rolling prairie. In winter, snow collects in the depression where a roof once stood. In summer, grass grows thick over earth that once sheltered 68 cattle through the worst blizzard in Dakota Territory history. No marker identifies it. No historical society preserves it. The innovation that saved Adler's family and spread to dozens of other ranches became invisible through its own success, absorbed into common practice, then forgotten when common practice changed. But the arithmetic remains unchanged. January 12th, 1888. Outside temperature minus 30 degrees. Inside temperature 42 degrees. 72-degree differential created not by fire or fuel, but by understanding what Earth does naturally when given the chance. Friedrich Adler didn't defeat the children's blizzard. He built with it in mind. He calculated that Earth at depth stays stable, that animal heat trapped by thermal mass would raise the temperature above freezing, that 8-inch ventilation would balance air quality against heat loss. He trusted those calculations against the certainty of men who'd ranched longer, built bigger, spent more. And when neighbors found his cattle alive at 42 degrees while their own herds lay frozen in wooden barns that cost 7 times as much, the validation wasn't emotional. It was temperature on a thermometer. It was 68 living animals against a death rate that averaged 40% region-wide. It was survival mathematics proven through the worst possible test. The Earth holds warmth in winter, coolness in summer, steady and patient as stone. It doesn't demand fuel or technology or wealth. It demands only the willingness to dig deep enough and trust what the ground has been saying all along. Adler dug. He trusted. And in that hillside dugout, dirt-walled and sod-roofed, he proved that sometimes survival comes not from fighting nature, but from listening to what the ground was trying to teach him the moment he pressed his hand against that creek-cut clay and felt coolness that wouldn't change, no matter what the air above was doing. The steam still rises in memory, warm air meeting brutal cold, visible proof that Earth remembers temperature and holds it against the winter that tried to take everything. 42 degrees, minus 30. The difference was everything.